The nuts and bolts of learning objectives. This video tutorial should help you to effectively use and draft learning objectives in your teaching. By the end of this video, you should be able to explain the relationship between learning objectives and session design, differentiate between learner and teacher-centric approaches, describe the concept and the structure of Bloom's taxonomy, and construct learning objectives for a teaching session. First, why should you write learning objectives? Why is this an important thing to do? Well, it is a driver of good course or session design. In order to illustrate this, let's take a look at how teaching sessions are commonly designed. You're asked to give a talk or to teach a session, and here is what usually happens. You start to make the lecture. You think, what could I talk about? What do I know about this subject? And you think about what cool images do I have? And you might go through your image files and find examples of neat cases. You collect the images, do some research, and then make the slides. Then a few days before you give the talk, you may get an email request from the course director that says, please send 3 to 5 learning objectives for your session. And you may somewhat reluctantly sit down to draft them. And you'll think, what did I cover in that? You may have to go back through your PowerPoint or whatever your presentation mode is to see what you talked about. What should they have learned from me about this topic, and how do I consolidate this into a couple of sentences? And your learning objectives may look something like this. During this lecture, I covered the etiology and anatomy of, the natural history of, and the imaging findings of, whatever the topic was. In this scenario, the learning objectives are merely a description of what you did. This exemplifies what is called the teacher-centric approach. The focus is on you and what you did. Your thought process involved, what should I teach, what will I cover, and how will I cover it? This is also known as the content-driven approach or coverage, with the idea being that you throw some content at the students and hope that some of it sticks. But it's important to remember that it's not about you. The teaching session should be focused on and developed for the learners and for the learners' needs. Now let's contrast that with what's called the learner-centric approach to course or session design. The focus there is on what do they need to learn, not what do I want to teach. In the learner-centric method or approach, a significant amount of time is spent thinking about the learners and what their needs are. What should the learners know beforehand? What skills should they acquire as a result of my teaching session? What should the learners be able to do as a result of the teaching session? And how can I construct my session to help them achieve those goals? Once you have decided on what your primary goal is of the teaching session, you will then be able to determine the skills that the learners will need to achieve in order to succeed. These can then be specified as written learning objectives. What is the purpose of those written learning objectives? Well, they clearly tell the learners what the teacher's expectations of them are. It puts the focus on the learner, and it provides guidance to them in terms of their study efforts. Where should they focus their time and energy during their studies? And it helps them become more efficient learners. And ultimately, having written learning objectives helps them to succeed. In terms of the benefits for us, the teachers, having learning objectives helps to limit the content included in your session and forces you to focus on the most important concepts. Learning objectives also help to guide the development of your session, since each written learning objective should be addressed in your instructional design plan. Each learning objective should also be assessed. So by having written objectives, it helps to prevent us from assessing things that we haven't taught. This is also known as learning-focused design. You start by thinking about what learning is sought. You then specify this in the form of written learning objectives. Each of those objectives then need to be addressed in your instructional plan, and each of those objectives should be able to be assessed. The instructional plan, if followed, should lead to students being successful in their assessment. So the learning objectives, instructional plan, and assessment are all interrelated. As you can see, the learning objectives are central to this process. So now let's focus in on the learning objectives themselves. Not all learning objectives are equal. For any course or session that you're planning, you should have a core objective, which represents your overall goal for the learners. You then will need anywhere between 3 and 5 supporting objectives, and the supporting objectives represent what they need to achieve in order to be prepared to succeed in achieving the core. So again, for each teaching session, you typically want 1 core objective and 3 to 5 supporting objectives. Think of it like your core objective is the destination, and the supporting objectives are how you're going to get there. In this scenario, you are the travel agent who plans and coordinates the parts to end in the whole. There is a categorization scheme for learning objectives that's called Bloom's taxonomy. This organizes them based on their level of complexity. There are 6 categories of cognitive skills. The least complex, knowledge, forms the base of the learning pyramid, with higher levels successively more complex. This scheme or organization is based on the premise that advanced learning depends upon the acquisition of skills at a lower level. So first you must know something before you can understand it. And in order to apply the material, you have to understand and know it. So each level builds on the level below. There are verbs associated with each level. So for instance, for comprehension, which generally means to understand something, verbs associated with this include summarize, demonstrate, or discuss. Looking at the synthesis category, verbs associated with this include design, compose, modify, predict. Now, if you Google Bloom's taxonomy, this information is displayed in a variety of different ways, and there are different types of tables and charts that give you a list of action verbs that are associated with each level of learning. These can be very handy when you're first drafting your learning objectives because these action verbs will give you some ideas of how you can write your learning objectives. So let's look at the objectives that I've set forth for this video tutorial. My core objective is that by the end of this activity, you should be able to design a teaching session with core and supporting objectives. In this scenario, the action verb is design. So design falls into the synthesis category of cognitive skills. This is a high-level skill. You have to put together various pieces of knowledge, comprehension, the ability to apply the material, and put all that together before you can then go on and synthesize something. So a core objective often falls a little bit higher in terms of complexity on Bloom taxonomy than a supporting objective. The supporting objectives for this video tutorial include summarize the purpose of learning objectives, explain Bloom's taxonomy, describe the proper sequencing to design a teaching session, and draft session learning objectives according to the nomenclature of Bloom's taxonomy. The action verbs used in these supporting objectives are lower level complexity. Explain and summarize are comprehension. Describe and define represent knowledge. And construct is a little bit higher, it falls into the application area. So the supporting objectives are typically of a lower level of complexity than the core objective. There are 5 key components of learning objectives. The first is they should be specific. Use an action verb from Bloom's taxonomy so it's very clear what the expectation of the learner is. Each learning objective should be measurable, so make sure that there is a way to assess success in achieving your written objective. They should be attainable, and that is with respect to the audience and to the time frame. So if you have a 1-hour teaching session, for instance, make sure that what you're asking the students to learn or to do is accomplishable within that time frame. Learning objectives should be relevant, make sure they address important points, and they should be targeted to the desired level of learning. So if you have novice learners or an introductory course, your learning objectives may be more heavily weighted towards lower levels of complexity as compared with an advanced course or maybe a seminar where the learning objectives may be a little higher in Bloom's taxonomy in terms of complexity. So how do you go about writing learning objectives? You should finish the sentence, at the end of this session, the learner should be able to, and in that line insert an action verb from Bloom's taxonomy. If it's applicable, you should also include the setting, such as on a standardized patient or on an oral examination. Or in the case of radiology, we're often asking them to be able to diagnose or identify imaging findings, so specify the modality, such as on a chest radiograph. You want to be as specific as possible to make the learning implicit. So an objective that might say the student should be able to recognize and categorize renal masses is a little bit too broad. Do you want the learner to be able to categorize renal masses based on their imaging appearance, and if so, which modalities? Do you want them to categorize renal masses according to their aggressiveness? So make it as specific as possible so the learners really understand what's expected of them. You should then go on and critique your own learning objectives. First, are they clear enough? By achieving the listed learning objective, the learner should feel confident that they have succeeded in your session. Think about whether your objective clearly states what you expect them to know or to be able to do as a result of your session. Are they attainable? Think about this with respect to the time frame and the setting of the teaching session. If you have a 1-hour teaching session, make sure that you are not asking the learners to do more than they are capable of doing in that time frame. Are they targeted appropriately to the learner group? Is the complexity of your learning objective appropriate? An introductory course, again, may have lower level objectives, at least initially, and throughout the course of that instruction, those learning objectives may increase in complexity over time. If you're teaching to a group of fellows in radiology, your objectives will look a little bit different than they should look if you're teaching to first-year residents. And it's important to look at each of your learning objectives and ask yourself, are they valid? Is it important for the students to learn this material? Ask yourself, why am I having them learn this? Historically, I used to give a talk about imaging risks, and one of my initial learning objectives was list the risks of radiography. Now, this might be an appropriate learning objective for an entry-level or introductory course like first-year anatomy when they're first learning about radiography. But I realized when I asked myself, why do I want them to do this? As they progressed into second and third year, I don't just want the students to be able to list the risks of radiography. What I really want them to be able to do is to counsel a patient about the risks of radiography. So with each of your objectives, ask yourself, what's the big idea? So what? What skill do I really want them to be able to do? And I'll end by summarizing the key points. First, as you plan your teaching session, remember to consider your learners' needs and to define your goals for them. Write down your overall goal as the core learning objective and write down the supporting objectives that they'll need to accomplish in order to achieve the core. Remember to use Bloom's taxonomy action verbs to make the learning as implicit as possible. And lastly, remember to critique your own learning objectives, and by going through this process, you'll be able to create clear, organized, and effective teaching sessions.